The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete parade ground at Naval Special Warfare Basic Training Command in Coronado, California. 23-year-old Sarah Martinez stood in formation with 47 other candidates, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The salty Pacific breeze carried the sharp commands of Instructor Chief Petty Officer Williams, whose voice could strip paint from a battleship's hull. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her uniform for the 100th time that morning. She had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, sitting in her grandfather's cramped apartment in East Los Angeles, listening to his stories about his time with the teams. Now, standing among some of the military's most elite candidates, she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. The other candidates around her looked like they had been carved from granite. Broad shoulders, thick necks, and the kind of confidence that came from years of athletic achievement and military service. Most were men, towering over her 5'4" frame. The few women in the group carried themselves with the bearing of Olympic athletes or seasoned warriors. Sarah, with her slight build and nervous energy, felt like a sparrow among eagles. Chief Williams began his morning address, his steel-gray eyes scanning the formation like a predator searching for weakness. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hell Week preparation. For the next 6 months, we will push your bodies, minds, and spirits to their absolute breaking points. Most of you will quit. Most of you will realize you don't have what it takes to earn the trident." His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than the others, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She knew what he was thinking. What they were all thinking. What was a girl like her doing here among these titans? The whispers had already started during the first week of training. During chow time, she caught fragments of conversation from nearby tables. "That little Mexican girl won't last 2 weeks. What is this, a diversity stunt? She's gonna get someone killed when the real training starts." Sarah tried to block out the words, focusing instead on the memory of her grandfather's weathered hands tracing the outline of his Navy SEAL trident tattoo on his forearm. "Mija," he had told her in Spanish, switching to English when he got excited, "this pin, it's not just metal. It's everything I am, everything our family fought for." Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had served with SEAL Team 1 during the Vietnam War. He rarely spoke about his missions, but Sarah had grown up surrounded by the artifacts of his service. Faded photographs of young men in camouflage medals tucked away in a shoebox, and stories told in hushed tones about brotherhood, sacrifice, and honor. Miguel had raised Sarah after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. He worked construction during the day and studied at night to become a U.S. citizen, never complaining about the double shifts or the aching in his aging bones. "Education and service, Mija," he would say while helping her with homework at their tiny kitchen table. "These are the things that make us strong." When Sarah announced her intention to join the Navy and attempt SEAL training, Miguel's reaction had surprised her. Instead of discouragement, his eyes had filled with tears of pride. "The ocean doesn't care if you're big or small," he had said, pulling her into a fierce hug. "It only cares if you can swim." Now, 3 weeks into the grueling preliminary training, Sarah was beginning to understand why her grandfather had cried. Every morning brought new challenges that seemed designed to break her spirit. 5-mile runs in soft sand, endless hours of calisthenics, cold water conditioning that left her teeth chattering for hours afterward. The physical demands were brutal, but it was the psychological warfare that cut the deepest. Instructor Petty Officer Rodriguez, himself a decorated SEAL veteran, seemed to take particular pleasure in singling her out during exercises. "Martinez," he bellowed during a particularly challenging rope climbing session. "Your grandmother could climb faster than that. Maybe you should stick to making tacos instead of trying to make war." The other candidates snickered, and Sarah felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. She channeled that fury into her muscles, attacking the rope with renewed determination. Hand over hand, she pulled herself upward, the rough fibers tearing at her palms until they bled. When she reached the top, she rang the bell with such force that it echoed across the training ground. Rodriguez nodded approvingly but offered no praise. "Decent time, Martinez. Now do it again." During the evening study sessions, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated from her fellow candidates. They formed natural groups based on their backgrounds: former college athletes, prior service military members, sons of military families. Sarah, with her community college education and civilian background, didn't fit into any of these circles. She spent most evenings alone in her barracks bunk, writing letters to her grandfather and studying the SEAL training manuals until her eyes burned. The technical knowledge came easily to her. She had always been a quick learner, but the social dynamics of military culture remained foreign and intimidating. One evening, as she reviewed navigation procedures, she overheard a conversation from the bunk area behind her. Candidate Johnson, a former Marine with arms like tree trunks, was holding court with several other trainees. "I'm telling you guys, she's gonna wash out the second we hit the real stuff," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet barracks. "Did you see her during the underwater knot tying exercise? She was shaking like a chihuahua." "Maybe that's her spirit animal," added Candidate Peterson, triggering a round of laughter. "A tiny, yapping dog that thinks it's tough." Sarah's hands clenched into fists around her study materials. Part of her wanted to turn around and confront them, to defend herself and her right to be there. But another part, the part that had learned to survive in tough neighborhoods by keeping her head down, told her to stay quiet and prove herself through actions rather than words. The next morning brought the dreaded pool competency test, a series of underwater exercises designed to simulate the panic and disorientation of combat diving. Sarah had been dreading this moment since the beginning of training. While she was a competent swimmer, she had never been particularly comfortable underwater for extended periods. The candidates lined up along the edge of the training pool, a crystal-clear rectangle that seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths below. Chief Williams stood at the poolside, his presence as imposing as a storm cloud. "Today we separate the SEALs from the SEALs," he announced, gesturing toward the marine mammals sunbathing on nearby docks. "You will complete a series of tasks while maintaining breath control and situational awareness. Panic kills. Hesitation kills. Failure to follow instructions kills. Are there any questions?" Silence. "Outstanding. Martinez, you're up first." Sarah's heart sank. Being selected to go first was never a good sign in SEAL training. It usually meant the instructors wanted to make an example of someone. She stepped forward, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The first task seemed simple enough: swim to the bottom of the 12-foot deep pool, untie a complex knot, and return to the surface. Sarah took 3 deep breaths, hyperventilating slightly to increase her oxygen stores, and dove. The water enveloped her like a cold embrace, and, for a moment, she felt peaceful. But, as she descended toward the bottom of the pool, the pressure began building in her ears and chest. The knot, a complex arrangement of rope and chain, seemed to mock her with its intricacy. Her lungs began to burn as she worked on the knot with trembling fingers. Above her, she could see the distorted shapes of her fellow candidates watching from the pool deck. The knot suddenly gave way, and she kicked hard toward the surface, breaking through with a gasp that echoed across the training area. "Time, 47 seconds, Chief Williams announced. Adequate. Next task, you will swim to the bottom, remove and replace your scuba mask 3 times, then return to the surface. Go." This exercise was designed to simulate the panic of losing equipment underwater. Sarah dove again, but this time, as she removed her mask for the second time, water flooded her sinuses and triggered an involuntary panic response. Her body screamed at her to surface immediately, but she forced herself to complete the 3rd mask replacement before kicking upward. She broke the surface gasping and disoriented, water streaming from her nose and mouth. From the pool deck, she heard snickers and whispered comments. "Looks like the little fish is drowning," someone muttered. Chief Williams studied her with an unreadable expression. "Martinez, report to my office after the training evolution." Sarah's stomach dropped. A private meeting with the chief instructor was rarely good news. She spent the rest of the pool session in a haze of anxiety, barely registering the performances of the other candidates. After the session ended and the candidates dispersed to their next training evolution, Sarah made her way to Chief Williams' office with leaden feet. The small room was decorated with military memorabilia and photographs of SEAL teams from decades past. Williams sat behind his metal desk, reviewing training reports. "Close the door and have a seat, Martinez." Sarah complied, perching on the edge of the uncomfortable metal chair across from his desk. Her wet hair dripped onto her shoulders, and she tried to sit at attention despite her exhaustion. Williams studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've been watching you, Martinez. Your physical scores are adequate, your academic performance is excellent, and your determination is notable." Sarah waited for the but that she knew was coming. "But," Williams continued, "SEAL training isn't just about individual performance. It's about being part of a team that trusts each other with their lives. I'm concerned about your ability to integrate with your fellow candidates." "Sir," Williams held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm not finished. I've heard the comments. I've seen the isolation. In combat, a SEAL who can't trust and be trusted by their teammates is a liability that gets people killed." Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back through sheer willpower. "Chief, I know I'm different from the other candidates, but I'm willing to work harder than anyone else. I'll prove that I belong here." "Different how, Martinez? Help me understand." The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah struggled to find the right words. How could she explain the weight of being the only Hispanic woman in a program dominated by men who looked like they belonged on recruitment posters? How could she describe the pressure of carrying not just her own dreams, but the hopes of her grandfather and everyone who had ever told her she wasn't good enough? "Sir, I know I'm not the biggest or strongest candidate here," she finally said. "And I know some people think I only got selected because of diversity requirements. But my grandfather was a SEAL, and he taught me that the size of your heart matters more than the size of your muscles." William's expression shifted slightly, and, for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Your grandfather was a SEAL? What was his name?" "Miguel Martinez, sir. He served with SEAL Team 1 during Vietnam." Williams turned to his computer and typed for a few moments. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read something on the screen. "Miguel Martinez, interesting. It says here he was awarded the Navy Cross for actions during Operation Crimson Tide in 1968. Sarah's heart stopped. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. Her grandfather had never mentioned receiving such a prestigious award. "Sir, I didn't know about any Navy Cross." Williams turned his monitor so Sarah could see the screen. There, in an official Navy database, was her grandfather's service record. Multiple combat deployments, numerous commendations, and, indeed, the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a classified operation behind enemy lines. "Your grandfather never told you about this?" Williams asked, his tone softer now. "No, sir. He only talked about his service in general terms. He always said the important thing wasn't what he did, but what he taught me." Williams leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with new interest. "Miguel Martinez. I remember that name from the SEAL histories. He was part of a legendary operation that saved an entire Marine platoon that had been pinned down behind enemy lines. The official reports are still classified, but the stories passed down through the teams describe him as one of the most courageous SEALs of his generation." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her with quiet dignity and endless patience, was a genuine war hero whose exploits were still remembered decades later. "Why do you think he never told you about his decorations?" Williams asked. Sarah thought about all the evenings she had spent with her grandfather, all the times she had asked about his military service. He had always redirected the conversation to her studies, her future, her dreams. I think he wanted me to make my own path, not ride on his accomplishments." Williams nodded slowly. "That sounds like something a true warrior would do. The question now, Martinez, is whether you're going to honor his legacy by earning your place here, or whether you're going to let the doubters convince you that you don't belong." "I belong here, sir," Sarah said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I may not look like what people expect a SEAL to look like, but I have the heart of a warrior. My grandfather taught me that." "Then, prove it," Williams said, standing up from his desk. "Tomorrow we start combat swimming scenarios. The water doesn't care about your gender, your size, or your background. It only cares about your skill and determination." As Sarah left the chief's office, her mind reeled with the revelations about her grandfather's heroic past. She had come to SEAL training carrying the weight of his expectations and her own insecurities. Now she understood that she was also carrying the legacy of a true American hero. That evening, she sat in the barracks and wrote a long letter to her grandfather, asking him about the Navy Cross and the operation that had earned him such recognition. For the first time since arriving at Coronado, she felt like she truly belonged there. But she also knew that the hardest challenges lay ahead. The whispers and doubts hadn't disappeared just because she had learned about her grandfather's heroism. If anything, the pressure to live up to his legacy would be even greater. As she sealed the letter and prepared for bed, Sarah caught her reflection in the small mirror above her bunk. She looked tired and worn down by weeks of brutal training, but there was something new in her eyes, a spark of confidence that hadn't been there before. She belonged here, and she was going to prove it to everyone, including herself. The letter from her grandfather arrived 3 weeks later, just as Sarah was beginning to find her rhythm in the increasingly demanding training regimen. She recognized his careful handwriting immediately, the same precise penmanship that had helped her with homework assignments throughout her childhood. Sarah waited until evening chow was finished before opening the letter in the privacy of her bunk. Her hand shook slightly as she unfolded the thin paper, wondering what her grandfather would reveal about his mysterious past. Mija, the letter began, I received your letter asking about the Navy Cross, and I have spent many sleepless nights deciding how much to tell you. I never spoke of these things because I wanted you to know me as your grandfather, not as a warrior. But, if knowing my story will help you find strength in your own journey, then it is time for you to understand what really happened during those dark days in Vietnam. The letter went on to describe Operation Crimson Tide in stark, unflinching detail. Miguel and his SEAL team had been inserted deep behind enemy lines to rescue a Marine reconnaissance platoon that had been surrounded and cut off for 3 days. Intelligence reports indicated that the Marines were facing overwhelming odds and would be overrun within hours. We were dropped 2 miles from the Marine position, Miguel wrote. The jungle was thick with enemy patrols, and we knew that one mistake would mean death for us and the Marines we were trying to save. But, when you wear the trident, you don't think about the odds. You think about bringing your brothers home. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she read about the harrowing night mission that followed. Her grandfather's team had fought through multiple enemy positions, using stealth and precision to eliminate sentries and clear a path to the trapped Marines. When they finally reached the platoon, they found 12 wounded men surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered them 10-1. The platoon leader had been shot 3 times, the letter continued, and most of his men were wounded. They had been without food or water for 2 days, and their ammunition was almost gone. When I told them we were there to get them out, I saw hope return to their eyes. That moment, Mija, is why we do what we do. The extraction had required Miguel to volunteer for what amounted to a suicide mission. While his teammates organized the wounded Marines for evacuation, he had single-handedly assaulted an enemy machine gun position that was preventing their escape. Armed only with his rifle and a handful of grenades, he had charged directly at the enemy emplacement under heavy fire. I was shot twice during that assault, Miguel wrote, once in the shoulder and once in the leg. But I kept moving because I knew that those Marines were counting on me. When I finally silenced that machine gun, my team was able to get all 12 Marines to the evacuation point. Not one American died on my watch that night. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading the letter. The final paragraph hit her like a physical blow. I never told you these stories because I didn't want you to think that violence and warfare defined me. But, now that you are walking the same path I once walked, you need to understand something important. The trident is not earned through individual heroism. It is earned through sacrifice for others. Every SEAL who has ever worn this pin has proven that they will give everything for their brothers and sisters in arms. This is what you must prepare yourself to do, Mija. Not for glory or recognition, but because it is who you are meant to be. The letter was signed simply, Your proud grandfather, Miguel Martinez, USN, Ret. Sarah read the letter 3 more times before carefully folding it and placing it in her footlocker next to a photograph of her grandfather in his Navy dress uniform. She now understood why Chief Williams had looked at her differently after learning about Miguel's service record. She wasn't just another candidate trying to earn her place, she was the granddaughter of a legend. But that knowledge also brought new pressure. The next morning, word had somehow spread through the candidate ranks that Sarah's grandfather was a Navy Cross recipient. Instead of earning her respect, however, the revelation seemed to intensify the skepticism from some of her fellow trainees. "So now we're supposed to be impressed because her grandfather was a war hero," she overheard candidate Thompson saying during morning inspection. "That doesn't mean she inherited his skills. If anything, it proves she's only here because of her last name." Candidate Johnson nodded in agreement. "Yeah, this is like military affirmative action. They probably figured having a Martinez with a famous grandfather would look good for recruitment posters." Sarah clenched her jaw and focused on adjusting her uniform. She had learned not to respond to these comments directly, but each one felt like a small blade sliding between her ribs. The physical demands of training were escalating rapidly as the candidates approached the infamous Hell Week. Every day brought new challenges designed to test their limits: endless hours of log PT, where teams of 6 candidates carried massive telephone poles through obstacle courses, cold water conditioning in the frigid Pacific Ocean, and navigate land navigation exercises through the California desert. Sarah's small stature, which had initially seemed like a disadvantage, began to work in her favor during some exercises. She could slip through obstacles that larger candidates struggled with, and her lighter weight meant she required less energy for endurance activities. More importantly, her academic background helped her excel in the technical aspects of SEAL training, demolitions, communications, and tactical planning. During a particularly challenging demolitions exercise, Sarah demonstrated a natural aptitude for calculating explosive charges and blast patterns. Instructor Petty Officer Davis, a soft-spoken SEAL veteran who rarely offered praise, pulled her aside after the session. "Martinez, that was textbook work on those calculations," he said quietly. "Your grandfather would be proud." It was the first genuine compliment Sarah had received from an instructor, and it gave her confidence a much-needed boost. But her moment of satisfaction was short-lived. That evening, during a rare period of downtime, several candidates were gathered in the common area discussing the upcoming Hell Week. Sarah was studying nearby when she heard her name mentioned in hushed tones. "I'm telling you, she's going to get someone hurt," candidate Richards was saying to a small group. "Did you see her during the surf passage exercise? She could barely keep up with the boat crew, and when things get really intense, she's going to be a weak link." Candidate Johnson nodded. "It's not fair to the rest of us. We're all putting our lives on the line, and we have to worry about babysitting someone who only got this far because of her family connections." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. She wanted to stand up and confront them, to defend herself and her qualifications. But a voice in her head, her grandfather's voice, whispered the advice he had given her years ago when she faced bullying at school: "Sometimes, Mija, the strongest response is silence. Let your actions speak louder than your words." The next morning brought the team-building exercise that Sarah had been dreading: the Zodiac boat races. Teams of 8 candidates had to work together to navigate their inflatable boats through a challenging course in the Pacific Ocean. The exercise required perfect coordination, communication, and trust between team members. Sarah was assigned to Team Bravo, led by candidate Johnson. As they prepared their boat on the beach, she could feel the tension radiating from her teammates. No one spoke to her directly, and, when they discussed strategy, they seemed to talk around her rather than including her in the conversation. Chief Williams gathered all the teams at the water's edge for his briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this exercise is about more than boat handling. It's about learning to function as a cohesive unit under pressure. Your boat crew is your family, and your survival depends on every member pulling their weight." He gestured toward the choppy ocean, where whitecaps indicated challenging conditions. "The water is cold, the seas are rough, and the course is designed to test your teamwork under stress. If someone falls overboard, it's your job to get them back in the boat. If someone gives up, it's your job to motivate them. There are no individual heroes in the teams, only successful crews and failed crews." As Team Bravo dragged their Zodiac into the surf, Sarah positioned herself at one of the middle paddling stations. Johnson took the coxswain position at the stern, responsible for steering and coordinating the crew's paddle strokes. "Listen up," Johnson barked as they pushed through the initial waves. "We're going to win this thing, but only if everyone does their job. Stay in sync, keep your paddle strokes strong, and don't be the weak link that costs us the race." His eyes lingered on Sarah as he said this last part, and she felt her teammates' skepticism like a physical weight. The first part of the course required the crews to paddle through a series of buoys in a specific pattern while fighting against wind and current. Sarah focused on matching the rhythm of the paddlers around her, putting all her strength into each stroke. Despite her smaller size, years of swimming and physical conditioning had given her surprising upper body strength. As they rounded the first buoy, Team Bravo was running neck and neck with two other crews. The second phase of the course required them to beach their boat, carry it 50 yards across the sand, and relaunch on the other side of a small peninsula. "Move, move, move!" Johnson shouted as they hit the beach. The 8-man crew lifted the heavy inflatable boat and began racing across the sand. This was where Sarah's size disadvantage became apparent. While she strained with everything she had, her teammates were clearly carrying more than their share of the boat's weight. She could see the frustration in their faces as they struggled to maintain pace with the other teams. But, as they reached the halfway point of the carry, disaster struck. Candidate Peterson, one of the strongest members of their crew, stepped in a hidden depression in the sand and twisted his ankle. He cried out in pain and stumbled, nearly dropping his section of the boat. "Peterson's hurt," someone shouted. The crew came to a halt, and Sarah could see the other teams pulling ahead. Johnson's face was a mask of frustration as he assessed the situation. Peterson was clearly in significant pain, barely able to put weight on his injured ankle. "We'll have to carry him and the boat," Johnson said grimly. "This is going to kill our time." Sarah looked at Peterson's pale, pain-racked face and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Johnson, put Peterson in the boat. The 7 of us can carry both him and the boat if we redistribute the weight properly." "Are you crazy?" Johnson snapped. "That's going to be twice as heavy. We'll never make it." "Yes, we will," Sarah said firmly. "Peterson weighs about 180. If we redistribute his lifting load among the 7 of us, that's only an extra 25 pounds each." "I can handle an extra 25 pounds. Johnson stared at her for a moment, clearly torn between his desire to win and his skepticism about her capabilities. But, with the other teams disappearing toward the relaunch point, he didn't have time to argue. "Fine," he said tersely. "But, if you can't handle it, don't expect us to carry you too." They lifted Peterson into the boat and redistributed their grip on the craft. Sarah positioned herself at the front, where she would bear some of the additional weight from Peterson's mass. As they lifted together, she felt the strain immediately. It was like trying to bench press her body weight while running across sand. But, she thought about her grandfather charging that machine gun position in Vietnam, wounded and alone, driven by nothing but his determination to save his fellow Marines. If he could do that, she could carry a boat 50 yards. Step by step, the crew made their way toward the relaunch point. Sarah's arms screamed in protest, and her lungs burned from the exertion. Sweat poured down her face, mixing with the salt spray from the ocean. But she didn't falter, didn't slow down, didn't ask for help. Halfway through the carry, she noticed that her teammates' attitudes were shifting. Instead of looks of skepticism, she began seeing expressions of grudging respect. Candidate Williams, running beside her, actually offered encouragement. "Looking strong, Martinez. Keep it up." By the time they reached the relaunch point, Team Bravo had fallen to last place, but they were still in the race. They slid the boat back into the water with Peterson positioned as a passenger, and resumed paddling toward the final checkpoint. The last phase of the course was pure endurance, a straight paddle back to the starting beach against wind and current. Sarah's shoulders felt like they were on fire from the boat carry, but she matched her teammates stroke for stroke, channeling every ounce of her determination into her paddle. As they approached the finish line, something remarkable happened. The other members of Team Bravo began calling out encouragement to Sarah specifically. "Strong stroke, Martinez. You've got this. Dig deep." They didn't win the race, they finished 4th out of 6 teams, but, as they dragged their boat up onto the beach, Johnson did something that shocked everyone. He walked over to Sarah and extended his hand. "That was some serious heart back there, Martinez," he said, his voice lacking its usual sarcasm. I was wrong about you. You've got what it takes." One by one, the other members of Team Bravo came over to shake her hand or pat her on the back. Peterson, hobbling on his injured ankle, was the most effusive in his praise. "You saved my ass out there," he said gratefully. "I would have been dropped from training if you hadn't come up with that solution. I owe you one." Chief Williams had witnessed the entire exercise from a follow boat, and, as the teams gathered for his debrief, Sarah caught him looking at her with an expression she had never seen before: approval. "Today, several of you learned valuable lessons about teamwork and leadership," Williams announced. In particular, Team Bravo demonstrated that true strength comes not from individual capability, but from collective determination. When one team member was injured, they adapted their strategy and accomplished their mission together. He paused, his eyes finding Sarah in the group. "Leadership isn't about being the biggest or strongest person in the room. It's about seeing solutions when others see problems, and inspiring your teammates to achieve more than they thought possible." That evening, for the first time since arriving at Coronado, Sarah was invited to join a group of candidates for chow. The conversation was still somewhat awkward, but the open hostility had been replaced by cautious respect. As she lay in her bunk that night, Sarah reflected on the dramatic change in her relationships with her fellow candidates. The boat race had been a turning point, but she knew that the real test was still ahead. Hell Week loomed just days away, and it would push all of them beyond anything they had experienced so far. She pulled out a piece of paper and began writing another letter to her grandfather, describing the events of the day and the lessons she was learning about leadership and teamwork. But, as she wrote, she found herself looking forward to the challenges ahead rather than dreading them. For the first time since arriving at SEAL training, Sarah felt like she truly belonged with these warriors in training. She had proven herself under pressure, not through individual heroics, but by serving her team when they needed her most. It was exactly the kind of lesson her grandfather had been trying to teach her all along. Hell Week arrived like a hurricane, sudden, devastating, and completely overwhelming. At exactly 0001 hours on Sunday night, the tranquil barracks erupted in chaos as instructors stormed through the building, banging pots and pans, shouting commands, and herding disoriented candidates out into the cold California night. Sarah jolted awake to the sound of Instructor Chief Martinez screaming inches from her face. "On your feet, princess. Welcome to Hell Week. You have 30 seconds to get outside in full gear or you're done." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity as 43 remaining candidates scrambled to dress and assemble their equipment. Sarah's hands shook as she laced her boots, adrenaline coursing through her veins like liquid fire. Around her, grown men who had seemed unshakable during regular training looked pale and nervous in the harsh glare of the floodlights. Chief Williams stood before the assembled group like a dark angel, his voice cutting through the night air with surgical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the next 5.5 days, you will be pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. You will be cold, wet, tired, and miserable. Most of you will quit before Tuesday morning." He gestured toward a brass bell mounted on a wooden post 20 yards away. "That bell represents your ticket out of here. Ring it 3 times, place your helmet at the base of the post, and walk away. No judgment, no shame. Just the knowledge that SEAL training wasn't for you." Sarah stared at the bell, illuminated by spotlights that made it gleam like gold. Already, she could hear some candidates breathing heavily, and she knew that several would be ringing that bell before sunrise. "Your first evolution begins now," Williams shouted. "Boat crews to the beach. Move, move, move." The candidates formed into 7-man boat crews and began the punishing journey to the ocean. Each crew carried a massive inflatable boat, small IBS, weighing over 180 pounds, plus paddles and safety equipment. Sarah's crew, now led by Johnson after their successful Zodiac exercise, hoisted their boat and began the half-mile trek to the surf zone. "Stay tight, stay strong," Johnson called out as they jogged through the sand. "We're going to show these instructors what we're made of." The first surf passage was a nightmare of crashing waves, frigid water, and disorientation. Each boat crew had to successfully navigate their craft through the violent shore break, paddle out beyond the breakers, and return to the beach with all crew members accounted for. Sarah's boat crew hit the water at a dead run, but the Pacific Ocean showed no mercy. The first wave caught their boat broadside and flipped it completely over, dumping all 7 candidates into the churning surf. Sarah found herself tumbling underwater, completely disoriented, her lungs burning as she fought to find the surface. When she finally broke through, gasping and choking on salt water, she could hear instructors on the beach screaming at them through bullhorns. "Get that boat flipped over. Move. If you can't handle a little water, you'll never survive combat." Working together, the crew managed to right their boat and climb back in, only to be immediately swamped by another massive wave. This pattern continued for what felt like hours: paddle out, get dumped, climb back in, repeat. By the time they successfully completed the evolution, Sarah was shivering uncontrollably and could barely feel her hands or feet. But there was no time to rest. The next evolution was log PT, an hour of grueling exercises using telephone poles that weighed over 400 pounds. 7-man teams had to lift, carry, and manipulate these massive logs while instructors screamed at them to move faster. Martinez. Instructor Rodriguez bellowed during a particularly challenging overhead carry. "Are you even touching that log, or are you just along for the ride?" Sarah gritted her teeth and pressed upward with everything she had. Her arms felt like they were going to tear from her shoulders, but she refused to be the weak link. Around her, she could hear her teammates grunting with exertion, all of them pushing beyond their normal limits. As the night progressed into early morning, the evolutions became increasingly surreal. Beach runs in the soft sand while carrying boats over their heads. Calisthenics in the freezing surf. Obstacle courses completed in the dark with only moonlight for illumination. The first casualty came during the second surf passage. Candidate Williams, one of the strongest swimmers in the class, got separated from his boat crew in the heavy surf and had to be rescued by safety swimmers. He emerged from the water blue-lipped and hypothermic and was immediately removed from training. "Williams is done," Chief Martinez announced to the exhausted candidates. "Medical hold. That's 1 down, 42 to go." By Tuesday morning, 6 more candidates had either quit or been removed for medical reasons. Sarah was running on pure adrenaline and willpower, her body pushed far beyond anything she had ever experienced. Her uniform was soaked with salt water and sand, her hands were raw and bleeding from rope work, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. But she was still there. Still moving. Still refusing to quit. The instructors seemed surprised by her resilience. During a brief medical check, Navy Corpsman Davis pulled her aside to examine a deep cut on her hand from rope burns. "How are you feeling, Martinez?" he asked as he cleaned and bandaged the wound. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Sarah replied honestly. "But I'm not quitting." Davis nodded approvingly. "Your vitals are actually better than most of the guys. Small frame, but efficient engine. That's serving you well out here." The comment gave Sarah a boost of confidence, but she knew that the worst was yet to come. Wednesday brought the dreaded Around the World Paddle, a marathon session where boat crews had to paddle their IBSs around the entire Coronado Island, a journey of over 20 miles in rough seas. Sarah's boat crew launched into heavy surf just as dawn was breaking over the Pacific. The beauty of the sunrise was lost on the exhausted candidates, who could only focus on the rhythm of their paddles and the burning in their shoulders and backs. 3 hours into the paddle, disaster struck. Candidate Peterson, who had injured his ankle during the Zodiac race weeks earlier, began showing signs of severe fatigue. His paddle strokes became erratic, and Sarah could see that he was struggling to maintain consciousness. "Peterson's in trouble," she called out to Johnson, who was steering from the stern. Johnson looked at Peterson and cursed under his breath. They were miles from shore, with no support boats in sight. If Peterson passed out, they would have to abort the evolution and paddle back to base, effectively ending his chances of completing Hell Week. "Peterson, stay with us," Johnson shouted. "We're going to get through this together." But Peterson's condition continued to deteriorate. His skin was pale and clammy, and his eyes were losing focus. Sarah made a quick decision that would define the rest of her Hell Week experience. "Switch positions with me," she told Peterson. "I'll take your paddle, you rest for a few minutes." "No," Peterson mumbled weakly. "Can't let, team down." "You're not letting anyone down," Sarah said firmly. "You carried my weight during team exercises for weeks. Now let me carry yours." She guided Peterson to a rest position in the center of the boat and took over his paddling station. Now she was effectively paddling for two people, maintaining the stroke rate for both her original position and Peterson's. The additional workload was devastating. Within minutes, Sarah's shoulders were on fire, and her lungs struggled to keep up with the oxygen demands of her muscles. But she thought about her grandfather's letter, about his willingness to sacrifice everything for his fellow Marines, and she found strength she didn't know she possessed. Johnson, seeing what Sarah was doing, began calling out encouragement and adjusting their course to take advantage of currents and wind. The other boat crew members, recognizing the extraordinary effort Sarah was making, dug deeper into their own reserves. "Looking strong, Martinez," Candidate Thompson called out. "You're a machine." For the next 2 hours, Sarah maintained her doubled paddling pace while Peterson slowly recovered. By the time they reached the halfway point of the course, Peterson was ready to resume his position, but the experience had bonded the entire boat crew in a way that transcended their previous relationships. "Martinez," Johnson said quietly as they approached the final stretch of the paddle, "what you did back there, that was some serious SEAL shit. You saved Peterson's Hell Week, and probably his entire SEAL career." When they finally returned to base after 7 grueling hours on the water, Sarah could barely stand. Her hands were covered in fresh blisters, her back was locked in spasm, and she was dizzy from exhaustion and dehydration. But, as she helped drag the boat up onto the beach, she felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. That evening, during the brief chow period allowed between evolutions, something remarkable happened. Candidates from other boat crews began approaching Sarah to congratulate her on her performance during the around-the-world paddle. "Heard you basically paddled for 2 people for half the evolution," said Candidate Richards, who had been one of her harshest critics early in training. "That's the kind of teammate I want watching my back in combat." Even more surprisingly, several candidates began asking her for advice on technique and mental strategies for coping with the extreme fatigue and stress of Hell Week. Sarah found herself in the strange position of being viewed as one of the leaders among the remaining 36 candidates. Thursday brought the final major evolution of Hell Week, the demolitions exercise. Each boat crew had to navigate through a simulated combat zone, place explosive charges on designated targets, and extract under fire. The evolution required everything they had learned during SEAL training: small unit tactics, demolitions knowledge, maritime operations, and teamwork under extreme pressure. Sarah's crew was assigned to destroy a mock enemy facility constructed on a small island off the coast of Coronado. They would have to infiltrate the island underwater, place their charges without being detected by enemy instructors, and escape before the simulated explosion. As they prepared their equipment on the beach, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm descending over her. After 4 days of constant stress and physical punishment, her body and mind had adapted to operating in crisis mode. Her movements were economical and precise, her thinking clear despite her exhaustion. "Martinez," Johnson said as they reviewed their infiltration plan, "you're our demo expert. I want you on point for placing the charges." It was a significant show of trust. The demolition specialist was typically the most experienced and technically proficient member of a SEAL team, responsible for ensuring that explosives were placed correctly and that the team could extract safely. The underwater infiltration went flawlessly. Using rebreathers to avoid detection, Sarah's crew swam over a mile to their target island, navigating by compass and timing in complete darkness. Sarah led the way, using her small size to advantage as they slipped through underwater obstacles and around enemy patrol boats. Once on the island, they moved with the stealth and precision of a real SEAL team. Sarah placed her dummy charges with textbook accuracy, calculating blast patterns and placement to ensure maximum effect on their targets. The enemy instructors, playing their roles with enthusiasm, never detected their presence. The extraction was equally flawless. Within 3 hours of beginning the evolution, Sarah's crew was back on the beach, mission accomplished. Chief Williams, who had been monitoring their progress, approached the team as they secured their equipment. "Outstanding work," he said simply. "That was a professional operation from start to finish." As Hell Week entered its final day, Sarah realized that she had fundamentally changed during the experience. The nervous, uncertain young woman who had started training months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who could function effectively under extreme stress and lead others through crisis situations. Friday morning brought the traditional end of Hell Week ceremony. Of the original 48 candidates who had started the program, only 31 remained. They stood at attention on the beach where they had suffered through countless evolutions, wearing their brown t-shirts, the badge of honor that marked them as Hell Week survivors. Chief Williams walked slowly down the line of survivors, making eye contact with each one. When he reached Sarah, he stopped and studied her for a long moment. "Martinez," he said loudly enough for all the candidates to hear, "5 months ago, some people questioned whether you belonged in this program. Today, I think it's safe to say that question has been answered." He gestured toward the other survivors. "These men have been through Hell Week with you. They've seen you at your worst and your best. They know your character and your capabilities. What do you think, gentlemen? Does Martinez belong here?" The response was immediate and unanimous. "Huya, Chief," the candidates shouted in unison. "She belongs." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since the beginning of Hell Week. Not tears of sadness or exhaustion, but tears of pride and belonging. She had proven herself to the most demanding audience possible, her fellow warriors. That evening, as the Hell Week survivors were finally allowed to rest and recover, Sarah sat in the barracks and began writing another letter to her grandfather. But, as she tried to find words to describe the transformation she had undergone, she realized that language was inadequate for the experience. Instead, she found herself thinking about the tattoo that her grandfather had shown her years earlier, the Navy SEAL trident on his forearm. At the time, she had seen it simply as a symbol of his military service. Now she understood that it represented something much deeper, a transformation from ordinary person to elite warrior, forged through trials that tested every aspect of character and capability. She wasn't a SEAL yet, that honor would only come after months of additional training and the completion of all qualification requirements. But she was no longer an outsider looking in. She was part of the brotherhood now, bonded to her fellow survivors by shared suffering and mutual respect. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her grandfather would be proud. 6 months after Hell Week, Sarah stood in formation for the final inspection before graduation from basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. The California sun beat down on the parade ground at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, but Sarah barely noticed the heat. Her focus was entirely on the ceremony that would transform her from a candidate into a United States Navy SEAL. Of the 31 Hell Week survivors, only 19 had made it through the complete training pipeline. The months following Hell Week had claimed candidates to injury, academic failure, and the gradual realization that SEAL training demands more than physical toughness. It requires absolute mental resilience and an unwavering commitment to excellence in every aspect of warfare. Sarah had not only survived but excelled. Her academic scores ranked in the top 5% of her class, her demolitions and weapons proficiency was exceptional, and her leadership evaluations reflected the respect she had earned from both instructors and fellow candidates. The small, nervous young woman who had arrived at Coronado over a year ago had been forged into something entirely different, a warrior. The transformation was visible even in her physical bearing. Her shoulders were broader from months of heavy lifting and swimming, her face was weathered by sun and salt spray, and her eyes held the quiet confidence that comes from having been tested beyond normal human limits and emerging victorious. But the most significant change was internal. Sarah no longer questioned whether she belonged among these elite warriors. Hell Week had burned away her insecurities and self-doubt, replacing them with unshakable faith in her own capabilities and an absolute commitment to the SEAL ethos of placing mission and teammates before personal comfort or safety. Instructor Chief Williams approached the formation, carrying a wooden case that contained the sacred tridents, the gold Navy SEAL pins that would officially mark their transition from students to operators. Each pin was a work of art, depicting an eagle clutching a trident, anchor, and pistol, symbolizing the sea, air, and land domains where SEALs operated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, his voice carrying across the parade ground to the families and friends gathered to witness the ceremony. "Today marks the culmination of the most demanding military training in the world. These 19 candidates have proven themselves worthy of joining the Brotherhood of Naval Special Warfare Operators." Sarah's heart pounded as she spotted her grandfather in the crowd of spectators. Miguel Martinez stood at attention in his dress blue uniform, his chest decorated with the ribbons and medals he had earned during his own service. At 83 years old, he still carried himself with the bearing of a warrior, and Sarah could see tears of pride streaming down his weathered cheeks. The Navy SEAL trident is not merely a piece of jewelry, Williams continued. It is a sacred trust, earned through sacrifice and sworn oath. Each man and woman wearing this pin has proven that they will give their lives for their teammates, their mission, and their country. He opened the wooden case and began calling candidates forward one by one. As each new SEAL stepped forward to receive their trident, Williams would pin it directly to their uniform, often driving the sharp fasteners through the fabric and into the skin beneath, a reminder that earning the pin required blood, sweat, and pain. Petty Officer Martinez, front and center. Sarah marched forward with crisp military precision, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Williams studied her face for a moment, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before: paternal pride. Petty Officer Martinez, he said loudly enough for all assembled to hear, you came to this command as a young woman with everything to prove and nothing to lose. You faced skepticism, discrimination, and challenges that would have broken most people. But you never wavered, never complained, and never quit. He lifted the golden trident from its case, the metal gleaming in the California sunlight. You have earned your place among the most elite warriors in the world through courage, determination, and an absolute commitment to your teammates. More importantly, you have honored the legacy of your grandfather, Navy Cross recipient Petty Officer First Class Miguel Martinez, whose own heroism in Vietnam represents the finest traditions of naval special warfare. Williams positioned the trident over Sarah's heart and pressed it firmly through her uniform. She felt the pins penetrate the fabric and prick her skin, but she didn't flinch. The slight pain was insignificant compared to everything she had endured to reach this moment. Congratulations, Petty Officer Martinez, Williams said quietly, stepping back to render a crisp salute. Welcome to the teams. Sarah returned the salute, struggling to maintain her military bearing as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Around the parade ground, her fellow SEALs and their families erupted in applause, but she was focused entirely on her grandfather's face in the crowd. Miguel Martinez was crying openly now, his hands pressed to his heart as he watched his granddaughter receive the same honor he had earned over 50 years earlier. When their eyes met across the distance, he mouthed a single word: proud. After the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah was immediately surrounded by her fellow graduates and their families. But she only had eyes for her grandfather, who was making his way slowly through the crowd toward her. When Miguel finally reached her, he stood silently for a long moment, studying the golden trident on her uniform. Then, without warning, he pulled her into a fierce embrace that communicated more than words ever could. Mija, he whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion, you have honored our family name beyond my wildest dreams. Your parents would be so proud. When they separated, Miguel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. I have something for you, he said, pressing it into her hands. Sarah unwrapped the package to reveal a small, black jewelry box. Inside, nestled in white velvet, was a silver pendant in the shape of a Navy SEAL trident. But, as she looked more closely, she realized it was much more than a simple piece of jewelry. This was made from the metal of my original trident, Miguel explained. The one I earned in 1966, before Vietnam. I had a jeweler melt it down and create this pendant for you, because I always believed that someday, you would earn the right to wear it. Sarah lifted the pendant from the box with trembling hands. Engraved on the back were the words, from one warrior to another, Abuelo Miguel. I can't take this, she said, her voice breaking. Your original trident, it's part of history. Miguel shook his head firmly. History lives in people, not objects, Mija. That trident served its purpose when it marked me as a SEAL. Now it will serve a new purpose by reminding you that warrior blood flows in your veins. As he fastened the pendant around her neck, Sarah felt the weight of 3 generations of military service settling on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as wings that would carry her to heights she had never imagined possible. There's something else, Miguel said, reaching into another pocket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked old and worn. I received a letter yesterday from someone I haven't heard from in over 40 years. Sarah unfolded the paper to find a handwritten note on official Navy letterhead. The signature at the bottom made her gasp: Admiral James Richardson, Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. Dear Chief Martinez, the letter began, I had the privilege of serving as a young lieutenant with SEAL Team 1 when you conducted your heroic actions during Operation Crimson Tide. Your courage and dedication to your fellow warriors inspired an entire generation of SEALs, including myself. The letter continued, I wanted you to know that I personally reviewed your granddaughter's training records and performance evaluations. She has demonstrated the same exceptional character and warrior spirit that made you a legend among the teams. The Navy and the SEAL community are fortunate to have another Martinez wearing the trident. Sarah read the letter twice before the full impact hit her. Not only had she earned her place as a SEAL, but she had done so with the knowledge and approval of the highest-ranking SEAL officer in the Navy, a man who had served with her grandfather decades earlier. How does it feel, Miguel asked gently, to know that the circle is complete? Sarah looked around the parade ground, where her fellow graduates were celebrating with their families. These were her brothers and sisters now, bound together by shared trials and an unbreakable code of honor. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the doubts, the struggles, the moments when quitting seemed like the only rational choice. But she also thought about the lessons her grandfather had taught her about perseverance, service, and the importance of fighting for something greater than yourself. Those lessons had sustained her through the darkest moments of training and had ultimately delivered her to this pinnacle of achievement. It feels like coming home, she said finally. Not to a place, but to who I was always meant to be. Later that evening, at the traditional graduate celebration dinner, Sarah found herself seated at the head table with her fellow SEALs and their families. Chief Williams, who had tormented them all for months, was now relaxed and jovial, sharing war stories and treating the new graduates as equals rather than students. When Williams raised his glass for a toast, the entire room fell silent. To the newest members of the Brotherhood, he began, you have earned your place through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. You join a lineage that stretches back to the frogmen of World War II, through the jungles of Vietnam, and into the conflicts of today. He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. Some of you came from military families, others from civilian backgrounds. Some of you were athletes, others were scholars. But all of you have proven that the size of your heart matters more than the size of your muscles, that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. Williams raised his glass higher. To the teams. To the teams, the room responded in unison. As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The same waters that had nearly drowned her during Hell Week now sparkled peacefully under the moonlight, and she could hear the gentle sound of waves washing against the shore. Her grandfather joined her on the balcony, moving slowly but with dignity. For several minutes, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the ocean and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. What happens next? Miguel asked eventually. Sarah touched the silver pendant at her throat, feeling the weight of her new responsibilities. Advanced training, then, assignment to a SEAL team. Probably years of deployments, dangerous missions, and challenges I can't even imagine yet. Are you ready for that? Sarah considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she would have answered with bravado, trying to convince both her grandfather and herself that she was prepared for anything. Now, with the wisdom earned through trials that had tested every aspect of her character, she gave a more honest response. I don't know if anyone is ever truly ready for what SEALs are asked to do, she said. But I know that I have the training, the teammates, and the foundation you gave me. And I know that whatever challenges come, I'll face them the same way you taught me to face everything else, with courage, honor, and absolute commitment to my brothers and sisters in arms. Miguel nodded approvingly. That's all any warrior can ask for, the chance to serve something greater than themselves alongside people who share their values. As they prepared to leave the balcony and rejoin the celebration, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the uncertain girl who had arrived at Coronado over a year earlier. This woman stood tall, confident in her abilities and secure in her identity as both a SEAL and a Martinez. The golden trident on her uniform caught the light from inside, and, for just a moment, Sarah could swear she saw her grandfather's spirit smiling back at her from the reflection. not the elderly man standing beside her, but the young warrior who had charged that machine gun position in Vietnam, driven by the same sense of duty and brotherhood that now flowed in her veins. "Ready to go back inside, Mija?" Miguel asked. "Ready," Sarah replied, straightening her uniform and checking her appearance one final time. As they walked back into the celebration, Sarah felt the weight of her new identity settling comfortably on her shoulders. She was no longer Sarah Martinez, the girl who was mocked for thinking she could become a SEAL. She was Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEAL, ready to carry on the warrior legacy that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family. The doubters had been silenced, not by words or arguments, but by the golden trident on her chest and the blood, sweat, and tears that had earned her the right to wear it. She was home.